Guadalcanal, August-September, 1942. The bow ramp dropped with a clang that Joe Sanchez felt through his boots. Seabee, chief petty officer, heavy equipment man from New Mexico, he had driven bulldozers through rain gullies and floodplains, but never into shellfire. The grey water of Iron Bottom Sound slapped at the lip of the landing craft, already flecked with geysers from Japanese shells probing for the beach. The coxswain yelled something Joe did not hear over the engine roar. It did not matter. There was only one direction to go. He eased the caterpillar forward, 12 tons of metal rolling into the surf, the blade throwing a white bow wave. For a moment the dozer floated, treads churning seawater instead of soil, engine note climbing in protest. Then the pads bit sand, and the machine lurched forward like a stubborn animal that had decided to live. Joe tasted salt and cordite behind his rubber mask and thought, not for the first time, that this was a stupid way to die. On the slope above Lunga Point, Japanese officers watched the scene through field glasses. To them, the Americans looked insane. Jungle, in their doctrine, was a fortress gifted by the emperor himself. Hills, ravines, swamp, and kunai grass were allies if you dug in, camouflaged, and trained men to move and shoot in green tunnels. They had carved airstrips into Rabaul and fields into the coral of Tulagi with gangs of labourers and hand tools. It had taken months. They assumed any enemy would need the same time. Down on the beach, the Americans had brought something different. Farm machinery with steel helmets and dog tags. Joe drove off the sand and into the first line of palms, following an MP waving a steel pot like a semaphore flag toward the half-finished strip the Marines had captured and renamed Henderson Field. The Japanese had left it as a raw scar, just long enough to serve light bombers, with drainage that turned every rain into a swamp. The Marines needed more. They needed it longer, wider, stronger. They needed it yesterday. The first shells that landed near Joe's dozer were badly ranged. Brown fountains of coral and sand leapt up 100 yards away, then closer. The dozer rattled, engine coughing as shrapnel hissed through the trees. Joe ducked by instinct, though the blade in front of him and the armor plate they had welded across the radiator were the only protection that mattered. Someone in the 1st Marine Division had decided that heavy equipment was worth saving. The steel plate and sandbags bolted around the engine turned the dozer into an ungainly, open-topped tank. A Marine ran in front of his blade, windmilling his arms. Joe throttled back, leaned out. "Crater on the strip!" the Marine yelled. "Big one! Need you now!" Henderson Field, that afternoon, did not look like the kind of thing nations fought over. It was a rough ribbon of packed coral and earth, staked out between jungle and sea, littered with the wreckage of Japanese equipment the Marines had not yet dragged away. The heat baked fuel fumes into the air. The handmade control tower was a platform on stilts. The radio sets crackled with half-learned call signs. Yet every transport that reached Guadalcanal brought more aircraft, more parts, more pilots who had been promised a place to land. When the Japanese guns reached in from the hills or from the sea, they aimed at that promise. Joe crept the dozer out onto the strip, following fresh gouges and tire tracks, until he found the crater. A shell from a cruiser had dropped into the midpoint of the runway like an enormous fist, punching a hole the size of a cottage into the coral. A squad of Marines with shovels and wheelbarrows were already there, sweating and cursing, but their work was hopeless. Joe did not need an order. He dropped the blade and opened the throttle. The trick, he had learned on other islands, was to think in minutes, not in yards. A crater that looked like a disaster to a pilot on final approach was just a volume of material to a man behind a blade. You cut away the rim, shove the loose rock inward, crush it with the weight of your own machine, then call for truckloads of fresh coral to finish the job. The stopwatch started the moment the first shell hit. The pilot of the next returning Wildcat did not care about your effort, only whether the hole was gone when his wheels met the ground. Above the jungle, Japanese pilots in Zero fighters banked and turned, waiting for orders to hit the airfield again. Their commanders believed, with some logic, that if they could crater Henderson faster than the Americans could repair it, they could strangle the island. Every bomb was a subtraction from American strength. Every gouge in coral was a delay in sortie rates. On paper, in staff tables drawn up at Rabaul, artillery plus air power plus jungle equaled denial. What no one in those bamboo map rooms had calculated was the cubic yards per hour a bulldozer could move. In the weeks that followed, the battle for Henderson became a duel between steel blades and explosives. Japanese cruisers crept down the slot under cover of night, flinging star shells and heavy rounds toward the strip. Bombers droned in at dawn and dusk, dropping stick after stick along the runway. Each time they hit, earth and coral leapt, equipment shattered, aircraft burned, and men died. Each time they left, engines coughed back to life in the dust. The Seabees and marine engineers learned to sleep in fragments, boots on, a few yards from their machines. When the last bomb blast of a raid rolled away, a whistle or a shouted name brought them scrambling onto dozer seats and graders. Headlights stabbed through dust clouds, blades dropped, and the roar of engines replaced the whine of falling steel. The strip that had been torn open at midnight was patched by dawn. Fighters that had sheltered in revetments taxied onto what had, hours before, been a smoking crater. In post-war interrogations, Japanese officers repeatedly expressed the same bewildered respect. Their bombardment plans assumed time constants measured in days. American engineers on Guadalcanal worked in hours and sometimes minutes. A raid that cost Tokyo fuel, aircraft, and precious trained crews bought at best a temporary inconvenience. The jungle that Japanese infantry treated as ally and shield was, to the men behind the blades, simply raw material to be cut, shoved, and compacted. Every tree that Joe's dozer knocked down became revetment fill for a fighter bay. Every ravine that once hid a Japanese patrol became a drainage ditch lined with culvert pipe. Every contour line on a map was something to flatten or exploit, not a sacred feature. The Marines joked that the Seabees were more dangerous to the local ecology than any bomb. Joe did not think about it in those terms. He thought about the way the runway surface felt under his boots when he stepped off the dozer. No soft spots, no loose chunks, no hidden lips to grab a landing gear. When the first American bombers began using Henderson in earnest, the stakes of the stopwatch war changed. A damaged fighter might belly in on a torn-up strip and save its pilot. A fully loaded bomber needed every foot of firm surface to lumber into the air with its belly full of explosives bound for Japanese ships and airfields. The Japanese admirals who had once dismissed the Guadalcanal airfield as a temporary nuisance began referring to it with a new, grudging respect, the airfield that refused to die. On the ground, to Joe, the transformation was measured in tasks, not in titles. One day he was cutting a taxiway through scrub so more planes could park without blocking the strip. Another he was shoving wreckage into a pit so that no pilot would have to land with the silhouette of a burned-out bomber at the edge of his vision. The jungle did not care. It tried, always, to come back. Grass poked through fill. Rain cut new channels. Roots sought the edges of compacted coral. The dozer blade went forward again. The rifles and machine guns and artillery on Guadalcanal wrote the loud, bloody story that showed up in headlines. But there was another battle running underneath, quieter and more relentless. It pitted men with shovels and blades against the idea that terrain and destruction could dictate the tempo of war. Henderson Field's survival turned on the simple question of whether a crater could be filled faster than a bomber could circle and line up another attack. In that contest, a bulldozer's blade, pushed by diesel and stubbornness, proved to be as decisive a weapon as any gun. It did not look like the kind of building that would help win a world war. No grand arch, no sweeping rafters, no elegant curve like the hangars at Langley or Pearl or San Diego. Just a rectangular steel box sitting on an Ohio airfield, bolted panels, straight walls, flat roof, corners sharp as a carpenter's square. Engineers at Wright Field joked that a child with a ruler could have drafted it in 2 minutes. Pilots called it the crate. One officer, with a mixture of pity and amusement, asked, "Who in blazes thinks you can build a modern aviation revolution in a farm shed?" The answer, though no one knew it yet, was the entire United States Army Air Corps. The box had been built fast, too fast, some inspectors grumbled. But that was the point. In the late autumn of 1939, as Europe went up in flames, the Air Corps needed a space where engineers could tear apart prototypes, redesign cockpits, shorten production cycles, and generate the test data that factories would rely on once America entered the war. They did not need beauty. They needed throughput. Inside that box, the rules that had governed American aircraft design since the end of the Great War went into the trash. The first thing visitors noticed was the noise. Not the roar of engines that came later, but the clang of wrenches, the whine of drills, the barked arguments of engineers who had slept on cots in corners for days at a time. The building was divided into lanes like an assembly line in reverse. At one end, aircraft arrived battered from testing ranges. At the other end, they emerged altered, instrumented, sometimes unrecognizable. What the officers at Wright Field were building was not just a hangar, but a doctrine. If you want to mass-produce air power, then the design, testing, and repair pipeline must itself be mass-producible. Bolted steel frames, interchangeable parts, modular electrical systems, these were not glamorous ideas, but they were the ideas that allowed America to build aircraft not by the hundreds, but by the hundreds of thousands. It started with the first test, P-40 and P-38 airframes rolled into the box for evaluation. The engineers discovered that nearly every manufacturer had its own wiring layout, its own fuel line routing, its own instrument placement, and its own maintenance philosophy. Good for artisans, catastrophic for a global war. The box hangar team set out to standardize everything. Uniform control layouts, color-coded electrical systems, universal tool access points, and inspection panels that could be removed in minutes rather than hours. The officers who had scoffed at the building began to sit quietly during briefings as charts showed what the changes meant in practice. An overhaul that once took 40 hours could now be done in 6. A wiring repair that required partial disassembly now needed only a screwdriver. A factory that had produced 20 aircraft a month could, with standardized assemblies, produce 20 aircraft a week. The engineers at Wright Field measured their success not by prototypes flown, but by minutes saved. By the spring of 1942, the crate hangar had become an engine of transformation. Aircraft designs flowed through it like water. P-40s, P-38s, B-17s, experimental airframes, rejected blueprints, captured components. Every iteration came out faster, simpler, easier to build. A bomber crew chief watching a B-17 modification line joked, "Hell, you could teach a farmer to wire this thing now." And that was exactly the idea, because soon, American factories would be filled with teenagers, farmhands, machinists, and women who had never riveted aluminum in their lives. They would not need artistry. They would need clarity. When a production board finally showed what the streamlining meant, even the skeptics stopped laughing. In 1942 alone, America produced more aircraft than Japan had built since 1931. By 1944, the United States would build nearly 100,000 aircraft in a single year, and, at the center of that tsunami of aluminum and engines, was the ugly little building at Wright Field, proof that victory could grow from a rectangle of bolted steel. The officers who once called it ridiculous would later stand inside it, listening to the echoing silence after the war, and realize that this unlovely box had helped make an air force capable of reshaping the world. The hangar did not soar. It did not impress. It did not inspire art, but it worked precisely, relentlessly, and at a scale the Axis could never match. It was the architectural embodiment of American industrial warfare, a factory for ideas, a crucible for speed, a box that helped build 300,000 warplanes. And in the Pacific, over Guadalcanal and the Solomons, men like Joe Sanchez would learn what that meant: airfields defended by blades of steel, skies defended by machines born in a plain steel room in Ohio, where victory had been measured with stopwatches, wrenches, and the hard geometry of mass production. European Theatre and Pacific Theatre, 1943-1945, how Allied bombers used an idiotic deception that worked far too well. The trick was so simple that many aircrews refused to believe it had ever fooled anyone. It did not involve new technology, new formations, or secret equipment. No radar jamming, no classified device. Just a pattern, an almost childlike motion in the sky that caused trained enemy pilots to miss their one chance to kill a bomber. It began, strangely enough, with complaints. Bomber crews in England wrote in their mission logs that German fighters always attacked from the angles where they were hardest to hit. B-17 tailgunners swore that Messerschmitt pilots had memorized every blind spot. B-24 waist gunners said that enemy fighters came in from 11 o'clock and 1 o'clock high with uncanny precision. Something had to be done. At an Air Force briefing in the spring of 1943, an operations officer scribbled an idea on a chalkboard. If the enemy knows your rhythm, then break the rhythm. The proposal that followed was almost embarrassing. Make the bombers drift. Not swing, not weave, just drift slowly, gently, subtly, inside the formation. The first tests were awkward. B-17s at Polebrook tried it small, lazy drifts left and right, up and down, no more than a few dozen feet. Gunners complained that the movement threw off their sighting. Pilots joked that it looked like the bombers were drunk. One colonel declared, "We are not teaching these boys to waltz, we are teaching them to hit Germany." But someone compared the gun camera footage from those test flights to previous missions. The difference was shocking. German fighters overshot. They misjudged deflection angles. They fired too early or too late. Their attacks no longer matched the geometry they had practiced for years. All because the bomber they thought they were targeting was no longer exactly where it should have been. The Japanese discovered the same maddening trick in the Pacific. In 1943, over Rabaul and the Solomons, the Imperial Japanese Navy deployed some of its best fighter pilots against B-24s and B-17Es. They had perfected a head-on attack doctrine. Slash in at high speed, open fire, break away before the bombers' guns could track them. It worked until the bombers started drifting. A Japanese pilot interviewed after the war described the moment he realized something was wrong. The American bomber was sliding like a boat in water. Not diving, not climbing, just sliding. When I fired, my rounds passed behind it, as if the ship had anticipated me. Another pilot said, "We trained against machines that flew straight. These did not fly straight. They floated." The real genius of the maneuver was that it looked accidental. No bomber telegraphed hostility. No bomber broke formation discipline. They simply refused to be where mathematics said they should be. Bomber crews who hated the maneuver at first soon learned to love it. During a mission in late 1943 Target, Schweinfurt Sergeant William Red Halperin, a B-17 waist gunner, noticed something strange. The fighters that had once carved through the formation with surgical precision now wasted entire bursts correcting their aim. A Messerschmitt came in from the classic 1 o'clock high angle. Red fired. Missed. The bomber drifted no more than a handful of feet. The German corrected too sharply. Red fired again. This time the German plane walked straight into the stream of 50 caliber rounds. It exploded into a confetti of metal and smoke. Red shouted into the intercom, "The damn drift worked! He flew right into it." The pilot responded, "It's supposed to. Keep at it." Pilots in the European theatre called it the idiot drift because it felt stupid to fly that way, and because no one believed the Luftwaffe would fall for something so small. But they did, repeatedly. Because once a pilot commits to an attack run at hundreds of miles per hour, even a minor adjustment throws off the firing solution, and German pilots had been drilled for years in precise deflection angles. When those angles were no longer valid, their entire attack doctrine collapsed. By 1944, bomber crews became evangelists of the maneuver. Drift your ship, it will save you. Don't fight your controls float. The drift buys time. Time buys life. Even fighter escorts noticed the effect. A P-51 pilot wrote in his combat report, "Bandits seem uncertain, their passes look ragged. Bomber drift likely interfering with their firing geometry." The Japanese, more than the Germans, despised the trick. Over the Bismarck Sea in 1943, a Japanese Zero pilot attempted a head-on pass against a B-24 that was drifting ever so slightly left. His attack angle collapsed. He overcorrected, stalled briefly, and was hit by the bomber's chin turret. Post-war, during the 1946 interrogation hearings, a former Japanese air officer sighed when shown footage of drifting bombers. "If you had taught this trick earlier, we would have lost more pilots earlier." By 1945, the doctrine was official. Bomber formations shall employ constant micro-maneuvers to disrupt enemy firing solutions. In other words, keep drifting, keep floating, keep being unpredictable. It never made headlines. It never earned a medal. It never became a legendary tactic like the thugh weave or finger four formation, but it saved thousands of lives. Sometimes, the decisive factor in air warfare was not armor, not guns, not speed, not even altitude. Sometimes, victory belonged to the aircraft that moved ever so slightly like an idiot. The trick no one should have fallen for. The trick that worked anyway. And the trick that helped bombers survive skies filled with men determined to kill them. Understood. Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Central Pacific. 1942 to 1944. How American bulldozers advanced faster than Japan could dig, fortify, or rebuild. Before dawn, before the first Zero rose from Bougainville or Rabaul, before scouts on jungle ridges radioed contact reports. American bulldozers were already moving. Their engines were the unofficial reveille of the Pacific deep, coughing roars that rolled across coconut groves and mangrove swamps. In the early phase of the war, Japanese officers often mistook these sounds for tanks. But tanks were rare in the Pacific. Bulldozers were not. The Japanese called them land ships, and they meant it with a mixture of awe and despair. On an island where it took a Japanese engineer battalion weeks to carve a single supply road with picks and shovels, Americans could land a barge full of caterpillars at sunrise and have a graded, compacted, two-lane path by sunset. In a conflict defined by terrain that resisted everything, heat, vines, insects, mud machines that converted jungle into poles, airfields were more dangerous than many weapons. Nowhere was this more obvious than at Munda, on New Georgia, in the summer of 1943. Munda Point was never meant to be found. The Japanese had built the strip under dense canopy, hand-clearing trees and hauling logs with human chains. From above, reconnaissance aircraft saw only a forest, but Allied photo interpreters spotted faint geometric shadows. Too straight, too regular, too clean. The Americans bombed it for weeks. The Japanese repaired it for weeks. Every crater was filled by men with basketloads of crushed coral. Then the bulldozers came. Within days of capturing the perimeter, Seabees hacked a new access road, widened the approaches, flattened the revetments, and turned the cratered strip into a functioning base. The change was so rapid that a P-38 pilot wrote in his diary, "Yesterday, this was a Japanese stronghold. Today, it is a parking lot with palm trees." The Japanese response revealed the Japanesite gulf between doctrines. While American bulldozers carved, graded, sculpted, and drained, Japanese engineers dug trenches, spider holes, machine gun pits, and bunkers. They worked with shovels, axes, and hands. Their fortifications were excellent. Their mobility was not. Every inch they built took sweat and blood. The Americans multiplied their effort using steel and diesel. On Namfa, in the Schouten Islands, the contrast became almost absurd. Japanese work crews had spent nearly a year constructing an airstrip. It was functional barely. It turned into porridge under rain. It could not support heavy bombers. Its taxiways were narrow footpaths. When American assault troops landed in July of 1944, the Seabees brought in over 30 bulldozers within the first afternoon. By the second afternoon, the old Japanese strip had been torn up, regraded, widened, drained, compacted, and reinforced. By the third afternoon, P-39 Airacobras were landing and taking off. Japanese prisoners were asked how long their unit had needed to build the airfield they had just lost. Their answer: 10 months. American engineers had rebuilt it in 3 days. Japanese officers understood the pattern but could not match it. Their war diaries capture the frustration. The enemy constructs airfields faster than we can destroy them. Bombardment only delays them for hours. Their machines are worth 1,000 laborers each. A post-war Japanese engineering officer, interrogated in 1946, put it more bluntly: "You built islands, we defended holes." And that difference decided campaigns. Every new American airfield turned into a launch platform for bombers and fighters. Every new airfield shortened the range to the next island. Bulldozers were not following the front, they were pushing it. On Bougainville, where Japanese defenders had carved tunnels into hillsides, the Americans landed and immediately began slicing corridors through the jungle. They did not bother with Japanese roads or captured clearings. They made their own. The Japanese dug deeper, believing underground positions would shield them from bombardment. They were right, but underground positions did not diminish the pace of American construction. Bulldozers did not care if someone hid beneath the earth. They only cared about what needed cutting, shoving, or flattening on the surface. A Marine on Bougainville remarked, "The Japs dig in, we dig through." And that summed up the entire theater. The ultimate demonstration of American earth-moving supremacy came during Operation Forager, the invasion of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in the summer of 1944. On Saipan, Japanese garrisons had created intricate trench networks, ravines fortified with interlocking fields of fire, and bunkers carved directly into volcanic rock. Their engineers assumed that even if the Americans captured the beaches, the rugged interior terrain would prevent rapid movement. Instead, Seabees bulldozed new roads through cane fields, coral mounds, and volcanic ridges so quickly that infantry commanders sometimes complained they could not keep up with their own support units. On Tinian, engineers surveyed the landscape and found that the northern plateau, flat, open, firm, was perfect for bomber bases. Within weeks, they had built what would become the largest and most advanced airfield complex in the Pacific. From those runways, B-29s launched the strikes that would devastate the Japanese mainland. Japan's entire pre-war aviation construction output could not match what American bulldozers built on Tinian in a single month. The Pacific War is often described as a naval war, an air war, an island-hopping war, but beneath every air raid and every amphibious landing lay another reality. The side that could move Earth faster would win. American bulldozers turned jungle to runway, swamp to depot, coral to fortification. They erased the natural advantages Japan had counted on. They rendered terrain, the Pacific's greatest defensive weapon, irrelevant. Combined with the hangar that standardized mass production and the drifting doctrine that kept bombers alive, the bulldozer was another piece of the same truth. In modern war, ingenuity and industry crush even the strongest fortress, and no fortress was stronger or more helpless than the Pacific jungle facing a determined Seabee behind a blade of steel. United States, 1940 to 1944. How a box-shaped building helped America build more aircraft than all Axis nations combined. The building was not supposed to look revolutionary. It did not curve like a cathedral. It did not gleam like a laboratory. It did not inspire awe in the way a warship or a bomber might. The structure that transformed American air power was, in the words of a confused visiting British officer, a rectangular barn knocked together by a man in a hurry, but looks deceived. What appeared to be a crude, inelegant metal box was, in reality, one of the most important industrial weapons of the Second World War. It was called a unitized assembly hangar, a simple, standardized, modular building designed not to shelter aircraft but to multiply production of them. Lockheed engineers called it a flow-through shed. Army procurement officers called it the miracle box. Factory workers simply called it the line. Japan never understood it. Germany understood it too late. But America put these box-shaped hangars everywhere: California, Michigan, Ohio, Texas, Kansas, each one eating aluminum and steel at one end and spitting out finished warplanes at the other. In 1940, American aircraft manufacturing was still small, scattered, artisanal. Skilled crews worked on single aircraft like craftsmen. Production was measured in single digits per month. The European War revealed the scale required. Britain needed fighters by the thousands. The United States Navy needed carrier aircraft by the tens of thousands. The Army Air Forces needed bombers by the hundreds of thousands of parts and tens of thousands of completed frames. The question was not what aircraft to build, it was where to build them. The answer was simple and ugly. Big metal boxes. Lots of them. The new hangar system was born at Lockheed's Burbank plant. The company needed to accelerate production of the P-38 Lightning, a twin-engine fighter so complex that early hand-built prototypes took months to complete. Lockheed's engineers proposed something radical. Instead of expanding upward into elegant curved hangars, they would expand outward into low-cost, rectangular metal buildings. The genius was not the shape, it was the flow. Aircraft parts entered through one end, moved through a linear series of jigs, fixtures, and workstations, and exited the opposite end as a completed aircraft. No clutter, no backtracking, no wasted motion. Every tool had a place, every worker had a station, every motion had a purpose. It was Henry Ford's assembly line adapted for wings. By mid-1942, Lockheed could complete a P-38 every day. By late 1943, they could complete one every hour, across day and night shifts. A visitor from the British Air Ministry wrote after touring the Burbank line, "They produce warplanes as though they were sausages." He meant it as a compliment. Boeing followed first. Then North American, then Republic, then Consolidated. By 1943, the United States landscape was dotted with these vast, identical rectangular hangars, each one a factory of decisive power. The uniform shape allowed uniform tools, uniform procedures, uniform training. When a riveter moved from a B-17 line in Washington to a B-24 line in Texas, she already knew half the equipment. When a mechanic transferred between a P-47 line and a P-51 line, he recognized the jigs immediately. This standardization became the quiet miracle of American air power. It slashed training times, it cut error rates, it multiplied flexibility. It turned any skilled worker into a transferable asset. Meanwhile, Japan built aircraft the old way: high-skill craftsmen, limited jigs, fragile lines vulnerable to bombing, decentralized production that prevented economies of scale. A Japanese army study in 1946 summed up the difference. The Americans built factories that built factories. Nothing demonstrated the power of the box hangar more than the construction of Willow Run, the Ford-built B-24 Liberator plant in Michigan. The hangar complex was so large that workers joked the state line should run through it. The building was a single, uninterrupted space over a mile long where bombers flowed from raw material to finished weapon in a continuous river of metal and sweat. The Germans laughed at the plan. The Japanese dismissed it as impossible. The Soviets doubted it could be heated in winter. Ford proved them all wrong. At peak, Willow Run produced one Liberator every hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The aircraft rolled off the line, engines already tested, guns already mounted, radios already installed, painted, and ready for combat. A B-24 contained over 1 million parts. Ford built them with unskilled labor trained in weeks. Japan struggled to build them with craftsmen trained in years. It was not a contest, it was a demolition. The box-shaped hangar had 2 additional advantages that Japan never overcame. First, survivability. The rectangular hangars could be built quickly, cheaply, and in clusters. If a bomber hit one, production simply shifted to another. If a German reconnaissance plane photographed one, the Allies could construct another in weeks. The Axis bombers could not destroy American aircraft production. American factories replaced themselves. Too fast. Second, scalability. Because the hangars were modular, every successful line could be copied instantly. A jig that worked in Burbank could be duplicated in Tulsa. A fixture that improved speed in Michigan could be shipped to California by rail. A technique developed in Kansas could be implemented in Texas in days. This was industrial Darwinism at high speed. By 1944, the result was staggering. Over 300,000 American aircraft built more than 100,000 fighters, more than 100,000 trainers, more than 70,000 bombers, more aircraft built in 3 years than Japan built in its entire Pernis. History Japan produced superb aircraft, but only in limited numbers. The Zero was a masterpiece, but masterpieces lose wars when fighting swarms of competent machines built by the tens of thousands. A Japanese pilot captured in 1945 put it bluntly, "We killed one of your fighters, you built 10. We killed 10. You built 100. We killed 100. You built 1,000. The arithmetic crushed Japan long before the bombs fell on Tokyo. In the end, the decisive symbol of American air power was not only the P-38 Lightning or the B-29 Super Fortress or the P-51 Mustang. It was the box-shaped hangar. Ugly, plain, rectangular, efficient beyond imagination. A building that turned aluminum into victory, steel into strategy, and machinery into dominance. In Europe, bombers shattered cities. In the Pacific, bulldozers shattered jungles. But in the United States, European and Pacific theaters, 1942 to 1945. How bombers survived by pretending to be incompetent, and why German and Japanese pilots fell for it again and again. The trick looked stupid. That was the beauty of it. Across both the European and Pacific skies, bomber crews discovered a tactic so counterintuitive, so reckless-looking, that enemy fighters often misinterpreted it as panic, incompetence, or mechanical failure. German and Japanese pilots, trained to read the sky like hunters, relied on patterns, speed, altitude, angles, energy. What they were not prepared for was deliberate chaos. American crews called it the idiot roll, or the falling duck, or dead air slipping. Japan's Zero pilots called it baka no ugoki, the movement of a fool. Germany's veterans of Jagdgeschwader units called it die dumme Kurve, the stupid turn. But it worked. The maneuver was simple. When a hostile fighter dove in for a kill, the bomber, or sometimes the escort fighter, performed a sudden, seemingly incompetent skid or wing dip, losing lift, losing altitude, and losing predictability. It looked like a stall. It looked like a mistake. It looked like a pilot about to die. In reality, it was the smartest thing he could do. The technique first appeared among B-17 crews during the early daylight raids over Europe. In late 1942, German fighters attacking from the classic high-angle approach relied on anticipating the bomber's trajectory. The B-17, with its broad wings and steady flight, offered a clean target unless it suddenly dropped like a stone. The first recorded successful use came during a raid on Saint-Nazaire. A B-17 nicknamed Chattanooga Choo Choo was about to be shredded by an approaching Focke-Wulf 190. The German pilot lined up perfectly. He had already begun firing when the bomber abruptly kicked its rudder hard to port, dropped its left wing like a dying goose, and fell nearly 100 feet in a single, sloppy lurch. The German overshot by yards because he had aimed where the bomber should have been. According to the after-action report, enemy fighter passed under nose, firing at empty air. Gunners raked his canopy at close range. The Focke-Wulf fell in flames. The bomber returned home. A new tactic was born. The maneuver's brilliance lay in psychology. German and Japanese pilots were trained obsessively to exploit predictability. American aircraft were heavier, slower to turn, and easy to lead if their path remained stable. But a falling duck, a sliding cow, a backer turn that was something else. A fighter pilot diving at 400 miles per hour had no time to recalculate against chaos. What looked idiotic from the ground was lethal at altitude. In the Pacific, the tactic evolved even further. Japanese pilots flying the Zero were deadly in turning fights but vulnerable during high-speed firing passes. In early 1943, P-38 pilots of the 339th Fighter Squadron discovered that a fake stall could ruin a Zero pilot's firing solution. Captain Thomas Lanphier, later famous for Operation Vengeance, described it during a training lecture on Guadalcanal. If a Zero is on your tail, give him a target he thinks he can kill. Show him your belly, waggle your wings, drop a few feet like you've lost control. He'll commit, then you snap roll out and rake him when he overshoots. The Japanese called it arrogance. American pilots called it survival. History called it effective. The Germans eventually encountered the most brilliant variation during 1943, the cripple trick. B-17 and B-24 gunners noticed that German fighters usually spared aircraft trailing smoke or falling behind, assuming they were already finished. Crews exploited this ruthlessly. Some pilots would briefly cut power to one engine, letting it belch black smoke. Others opened cowl flaps to create drag, mimicking a wounded aircraft. Fighters would swoop in for the easy kill straight into the defensive fire of every gunner waiting for them. A gunner of the 303rd Bomb Group described it. The Hun thought he was picking off a cripple. Instead, he flew right into a hornet's nest. The Luftwaffe learned but too slowly. Desperation makes hunters careless. In the Pacific, Liberator crews perfected an even stranger version, the broken box. When Japanese fighters attacked from the rear, one corner bomber of the formation would pretend to fall out of position, sliding diagonally downward in a messy drift. Japanese pilots always chased it, believing it broke formation due to fear. What they did not see, until too late, was the trap. The falling bomber lured them downward. Two top turret gunners from the box above swung into angle. The tail gunner of the falling bomber waited for the overshoot. 3 streams of .50 caliber fire intersected at one point, like a geometric execution. Japanese pilots learned to fear bomb group formations not just for their discipline, but for their unpredictability. Escort fighters absorbed the tactic too. P-47s feigned clumsy rolls to bait German fighters into dive chases, only to pull into steep climbs using their turbocharged engines. P-51s pretended to float lazily to lure Zeros into turning fights, only to snap into vertical maneuvers where the Mustang's power advantage was overwhelming. P-38s used the falling duck to trick Japanese pilots into overshoot angles. It was, as one P-51 pilot said, "You beat a hunter by acting like wounded prey." German and Japanese interrogations after the war revealed the frustration. From a 1945 Luftwaffe report, American bombers exhibit irrational motion. Attempts to predict their path result in misjudgment. From a 1945 Japanese Navy pilot, the Americans are not skilled, this is what we believed. Then we learned their craziness was skill. In the end, the so-called idiotic trick survived the war because it was never idiotic at all. It was adaptation. It was improvisation. It was understanding the enemy's assumptions and turning them into weaknesses. Machines matter. Production matters. Fuel matters. Industry decides wars. But sometimes, survival and victory comes from a pilot willing to look like a fool for 3 seconds in order to live for 3 decades afterward. The Axis powers never learned the final lesson. Predictability kills, chaos kills faster. Pacific Theater Logistics, 1942 to 1945. Why bulldozers, box hangers, and idiot tricks worked only because America fought a different kind of war, one Japan and Germany never had the capacity to join. The Pacific War is often described as an island-hopping campaign, as if it were a contest of geography. But beneath the jungle battles, beneath the carrier duels, beneath the air raids and night landings, lay a truth so enormous that most participants only understood it years later. America was not fighting the same war as Japan, not in doctrine, not in resources, not in logistics, not even in imagination. Japan believed war was won by courage, precision, and sacrifice. America believed war was won by movement, manufacture, and multiplication. A bulldozer blade pushing a road through jungle was not just a tactical act, it was a manifestation of national philosophy. A box-shaped hangar producing bombers by the hour was not just efficiency, it was industrial ideology. A bomber crew feigning incompetence to confuse pursuing fighters was not just a tactic, it was adaptive thinking supported by flexible training, deep manpower, and unending supplies. By 1943, Japan and Germany were discovering the same tragic realization. They had entered a race that only America had trained for. The first warning signs came during the Guadalcanal campaign, when Japanese officers studying captured equipment reported something odd. Every American object, from bulldozer blades to aircraft fittings to radio connectors, was standardized. Bolts, fuel caps, hinges, spark plugs, wiring, everything interchangeable. This sounds trivial until one understands the consequence. American engineers in the Solomon Islands could cannibalize a wrecked aircraft for parts that fit a bulldozer. Navy mechanics could take hardware from a P-40 and use it on a landing craft. Army electricians could recognize fittings on marine radios without training. Japan's captured air units, by contrast, wrote in frustration, "Every aircraft is its own factory. Each Zero variant required different fittings. Each engine change demanded specialty tools. Each airfield required custom-built jigs made on site." A Japanese mechanic once said in a post-war interview, "You Americans built war the way water flows downhill. We built war the way men carve wood." By 1943, the American production miracle was accelerating. Box-shaped hangars multiplied like a chain reaction. Ford's Willow Run was producing one B-24 every hour. Republic was building P-47s by the tens of thousands. North American turned out P-51s, faster than pilots could be trained to fly them. The Axis misread the situation completely. German intelligence, studying aerial photographs of American plants, concluded that such massive output must have been exaggerated. Japanese naval intelligence assumed that American industry would collapse under the strain of a two-ocean war. What neither understood was the most important fact. America had automated the war. Production was no longer an industrial contest, it was an inevitability. The Pacific reflected this industrial asymmetry in the most brutal way. When the Marines landed on Cape Gloucester, the Japanese assumed the jungle would halt them. Instead, bulldozers carved roads faster than infantry could walk them. When the Japanese fortified Tarawa's coral atoll, they assumed it was impregnable. Instead, Seabees blasted, scraped, and filled until landing craft could glide over reefs that had trapped the first assault wave. When the Americans reached Peleliu, the Japanese created a labyrinth of caves and kill zones, believing terrain would neutralize superior firepower. Instead, engineers drilled, blasted, paved, and burned through rock at a pace Japanese defenders could not comprehend. A Japanese officer captured on Peleliu told interrogators, "You do not attack terrain, you erase it." And that is precisely what America did across the Solomons, across the Gilberts, across the Marianas. Japan could dig one trench in a week. America could bulldoze a mile of road in a day. Japan could clear a landing strip in 3 months. America could build one in 3 days. It was not a fair fight. Even when the Axis recognized the industrial gap, they misinterpreted its meaning. They assumed greater numbers alone gave America advantage. But numbers were only the surface. Beneath the massive fleets and swarms of bombers lay the deeper truth. American logistics created time. Time to adapt. Time to repair. Time to innovate. Time to train. This mattered more than firepower. Consider the idiot tricks used by bomber crews and fighter escorts. The only reason they worked was because American airmen were trained deeply, repeatedly, without fear of wasting fuel, ammunition, or aircraft. They practiced every maneuver dozens of times. They failed safely. They learned what chaos looked like and how to weaponize it. Japan's pilots, on the other hand, could not practice aggressive improvisation. They lacked spare fuel. They lacked training aircraft. They lacked patience in their syllabi. They entered combat undertrained and overcommitted, relying on instinct instead of adaptation. When American pilots performed unpredictable behavior, Japanese pilots often assumed incompetence rather than design. That cognitive bias killed them. The box-shaped hangar explains this more clearly than any statistic. Inside those vast rectangular factories, American workers, many of them women who had never held a wrench before, 1941 built aircraft using step-by-step processes that anyone could learn. It democratized skill. It multiplied ability. It made complexity simple. Japan had no equivalent. Its aircraft factories were boutique workshops by comparison, skilled, precise, but slow and fragile. When bombs fell on Mitsubishi's Nagoya plant, it took months to recover. When bombs fell on American plants, production was shifted in days, sometimes hours. The industrial race was so lopsided that by 1944, American planners stopped asking whether they could build something. They asked only, "Where should we put the next hangar?" In the final year of the war, the consequences became catastrophic for the Axis. The P-47 Thunderbolt that German pilots once mocked was now present in such numbers that even destroying one squadron meant nothing. Replacements arrived the next week. The P-38 Lightnings hunting Admiral Yamamoto were flying from airstrips built in days. The B-29s that firebombed Tokyo took off from runways carved into islands that had not even existed on American maps 3 years earlier. Japan did not lose the Pacific because its soldiers were weak, or its aircraft obsolete, or its strategy flawed. Japan lost because it had joined a marathon with the conditioning of a sprinter. America did not merely outrun it. America reshaped the road beneath its feet. A Seabee behind a bulldozer had more strategic impact than 100 elite infantrymen. A welder inside a box-shaped hangar had more influence on the air war than a dozen fighter aces. A bomber pilot performing a foolish-looking skid had more survival odds behind him than a Japanese ace with perfect aim. The Pacific War was not won solely by force. It was won by velocity, the speed of building, the speed of repairing, the speed of replacing, the speed of learning, the speed of changing terrain, strategy, and material reality faster than the enemy could comprehend. The Axis fought with courage. America fought with momentum. And momentum manufactured, standardized, multiplied, became the most devastating weapon of the Second World War. Tinian, Mariana Islands, 1944. How bulldozers, modular hangars, and industrial momentum turned a small coral island into the most powerful airbase in human history. The first Marines who stepped onto Tinian expected a nightmare. Intelligence analysts predicted months of jungle fighting, weeks of heavy engineering, and a long, brutal struggle to carve usable runways from an island defended by elite Japanese troops and ringed with coral cliffs. Instead, Tinian fell in 9 days. That impossible speed stunned the Japanese high command. It stunned many Americans. But the Seabees, the engineers, and the planners who had watched America's industrial momentum devour the Pacific understood that Tinian was the logical outcome of a war where America no longer fought terrain or fortifications. It overwhelmed them. The Japanese garrison defending Tinian, a hardened force of nearly 10,000 soldiers, expected the Americans to attack from the obvious beaches on the southwestern coast. Those beaches were mined, sighted, fortified with machine guns, and backed by pillboxes carved directly into coral. So the Americans landed where the Japanese believed no landing was possible. They landed at 2 tiny strips of sand, named White 1 and White 2, narrow enough that Japanese officers dismissed them as irrelevant. Those beaches were protected by steep coral ledges that the Japanese believed made landing craft unusable. They had not accounted for American bulldozers. In the early morning darkness of July 24, 1944, Seabee dozers were chained to Amtraks and literally dragged up the cliffs. As soon as their tracks found purchase, they roared forward, blades down, carving ramps, crushing coral, and widening the landing zone. By noon, the impossible beaches were 2-lane, roads feeding tanks, artillery, and supplies inland. A Japanese officer who survived later said, "We built cliffs to keep the enemy out. They used machines to erase the cliffs." And that was Tinian in one sentence. But terrain was only the first obstacle. The real challenge, the one that planners in Washington cared about, was transforming Tinian into an airfield capable of launching B-29 superfortresses. That required runways miles long, taxiways broad enough for 4-engine giants, fuel farms storing millions of gallons, a logistics system feeding thousands of aircrew, a maintenance and hangar complex capable of supporting the largest bombers on Earth. Japan assumed this would take months. On paper, it should have taken a year. The Americans built it in weeks. The transformation began the moment the island's northern plateau was secured. Engineers surveyed the terrain and realized what Japanese planners had missed. Tinian's northern half was a natural aircraft carrier, flat, firm, covered in hard-pan soil, perfect for compaction. Within 24 hours, bulldozers were scraping coral. Within 48 hours, graders were shaping the runways. Within 1 week, the outlines of the largest bomber base in the world were visible from the sky. It was not magic. It was not luck. It was industrial doctrine brought to a battlefield. The same box-shaped modular hangars that had revolutionized production in the United States were now dropped into the Pacific like chess pieces. Prefabricated segments arrived on ships already cut, drilled, and labeled. Assembly required no welding teams, no custom parts, no skilled metalworkers. It required wrenches and manpower. That was all. A Marine officer watching their construction wrote, "It was like watching a child build with blocks, except the blocks were taller than a man." Japan had no equivalent. Japan had no counter. Japan could only endure. By mid-August 1944, the runways at North Field stretched nearly 2 miles longer than anything Japan had built at home. The airbase could park hundreds of B-29s. The fuel system pumped enough aviation gasoline to feed the entire 20th Air Force. The maintenance hangars, box-shaped and modular, allowed simultaneous servicing of dozens of bombers. When the first B-29 landed on Tinian, a ground officer wrote, "The wheels hit coral that had been jungle 14 days earlier." Japanese military engineers later told Allied interrogators, "We could not comprehend how Americans created airfields faster than we could plan them." The answer was simple. America had brought the factory to the battlefield. Tinian was not just an airfield. It was a machine that consumed coral and gasoline and produced destruction. Each B-29 sortie out of Tinian required thousands of gallons of fuel, hundreds of pounds of ammunition, precision bombs, maintenance labor, and mission planning. The island became the world's most advanced logistical engine. The Seabees built refrigeration plants, fuel tank farms, lathe shops, engine depots, radar stations, and power grids. And all of it emerged from bulldozers, modular hangars, and assembly line thinking transported halfway across the planet. This was the culmination of everything America had learned since Guadalcanal: how to erase terrain, how to multiply output, how to accelerate the tempo of war until the enemy could not adapt. By early 1945, Tinian's 2 massive runways, Northfield and Westfield, launched daily streams of superfortresses toward Japan. Sometimes over 100 bombers rose from the island in a single wave, their engines thunderous enough to shake canteens on mess tables. Japan could not strike Tinian. Japan could not rebuild airfields destroyed elsewhere. Japan could not stop the slow, inevitable takeover of the sky. One Japanese officer, interrogated in 1946, said, "We defended every foot of jungle and rock. The Americans did not fight for feet, they fought for function. If they needed ground, they made it." That insight explains the entire Pacific. The world remembers Tinian for one thing: the place where the B-29, Enola Gay, and Boxcar began the missions that ended the war. But Tinian's deeper meaning lies not in 2 bombers, but in the thousands that flew before them, and in the engineering miracle that made them possible. Tinian represented the moment Japan realized that the Pacific War was lost not on beaches, or in dogfights, or in fleet engagements, but on blueprints drawn in Detroit, on production lines in Burbank, and on bulldozer blades carving coral under the sun. Tinian was proof that America had turned war into a solvable equation. Bulldozers plus box, hangars plus airfields plus industry equals dominance. Japan fought battles. America built victory. The island that should have taken a year was built in weeks. And, from that impossible speed came an unstoppable force.